right. That's fine. Good evening. Thanks for being so loyal. Day 3, I see familiar faces. It's very pleasing. So today I looked at the original timetable or program that I proposed. And today was supposed to deal with land reform and so on. But given the way the discussion has gone over the last 2 days, where of the various categories of land I proposed as a way of looking at the land question, we have dealt with the communal areas, traditional authority areas. We have dealt with commercial farms. And we've been talking about the urban areas. And I thought that maybe today I should focus on the urban areas. And then tomorrow and Friday, we deal with the democracy period. Early 90s to... I say tomorrow we'll deal with the period of democracy, starting with the early 90s to 2017, and then get to the debate today. Yeah, which is still a heated one, I think.
So you had a wonderful thought about unused land.
Yes.
That could be a win-win for everybody.
Yes.
Are you going to explore that?
Yes. That's Friday. That's what I'm going to say. And because now I'm trying not to take the president seriously. When he says that you can expropriate land without compensation and without affecting food production. And I try to think very hard as to how that, you can do it. And I think it's doable. It is doable if you don't touch for the moment land that is in full production. And you target land that is underutilized and unused. Possibly land that is in debt. That's my argument, and it sounds simple, and some people, in my circles, academic circles, people think it's one way of looking at the problem. But politicians don't think so. Yeah, okay, but we'll deal with that on Friday. Not going to tackle that. So, I've said this before, that when you look at the land question as it was presented to us through the land reform program, and as it was debated up till December 2017, when the ANC made this U-turn, what I call a U-turn, one got the impression that land was about agriculture only, and it was about rural areas, farms, the former reserves, and so on. And yet, those of you who read my 2007 article to the Mail and Guardian, already then, from the outset, when I focused on this topic, I said that the land question is not about agriculture and rural only. It's much wider than that. And that, there is an urban element to the land question. Now, with all these categories, one could spend days, weeks, or even a semester course on one category because of the complications and so on. So we're just touching on what, in my case, and for purposes of this course, seen as a whole, touching on what I think is critical for us to understand the land question in South Africa, problems around this question, and how we can begin to address these problems. right? And and which is why I think that it is important for us to understand problems as they pertain to urban areas. And again, looking at the land reform program, we shall talk about tomorrow, there are instances where there is reference to urban land. But this is only insofar as restitution, the restitution component is concerned. There are three components of the land reform program that I'll elaborate upon tomorrow. Is the restitution component. And restitution is about claims that people could lodge where they can prove that they lost land after June 1913 or between June 1913 and December 31st, December 1998 as a result of racial legislation and or practices. So if you have a case that you lost your land as a result of that and you were not compensated, right, then you can lodge a claim. And if you look at sort of the table of the claims that were lodged, you'll realize that there were claims that were made in urban areas. And for those of us who live in Cape Town, the best known of those cases is District 6, right? So once again, I don't like generalization to say that the land reform program doesn't say anything about urban land. It does, but it is only in instances of restitution. The other programs do not focus on urban sort of question. If you look at government programs in their entirety, you will find that they deal with housing on urban areas. But housing is seen as something separate from the land question. And my argument is that housing is a land question. It's a land question as it presents itself in an urban context. And in what I'm trying to say today, I'll try and show you the connection or connections between housing and the land question as I've discussed it especially on Monday, when I was focusing on the former reserves. That's what the presentation will be about. Now, as already pointed out in the first lecture, Africans were denied land and property rights outside the former reserves. That we now know. This means that Africans were, in terms of colonial and apartheid laws, and I also stress that this situation arose because of legislation that was used. That through these laws, ownership of land and property in the cities was denied Africans. I have also shown that land shortage in the reserves made it almost impossible for Africans to make a living through land-based initiatives. I say almost impossible because, and I think I explained this in the first day, that there are land-based livelihoods in the former reserves, despite the stories we hear about poverty, inequalities, and so on. People still have livestock. And some people still cultivate their fields. But the point is, they cannot make a livelihood out of what they produce out of their land. Especially in a society like ours, where people do not only exist as animals to eat and survive, there are other things that they need to buy. Clothes, furniture, they have children to take to school, and so on. So if you take those, even at a minimal level, you'll realize that the land that people have access to is not enough for them to accommodate all these needs. So in order for them to accommodate not all the needs, but some of them, they had to go to work. And this happened as early as the beginning of the 20th century. People started going to the cities. The one thing that was brought to my attention that I didn't raise was that one of the reasons why people were forced to go to the cities, to the mines, to the farms, to earn cash, was that the taxes that were imposed, starting with the Cecil John Rose Glengarry Act, those taxes were paid in cash. You couldn't, give a goat or a pig to the magistrate and say, no, look, no, here's my tax and so on. So they had to earn cash. So even those who had stock were forced to go to work in order not to get cash. Now, when we're talking about these rural areas, we raised the question of landlessness on the one hand, but we also raised the question of cheap labor. Right. And I want to say a bit on cheap labor. Why cheap labor? Well, cheap labor became almost a policy. People like Harold Hulpy and so on have written extensively on the cheap labor policy of the colonial government. That was not even the apartheid government. And they argue that this policy was justified in terms of an assumption that migrant workers, who were the ones who went to the cities to go and work, left behind a family and land. That the family could feed itself on the land that was available in the reserves. And because of that, the wages of the migrant worker was not, it wouldn't be necessary for the migrant worker to be paid wages that would be more than what was called a bachelor wage. So the migrant worker was assumed to be a bachelor without a family. The family could survive on its own. That was the supposition, or the assumption that was made.
Like a woman. Women also got paid.
No?
But women also got paid, assuming that the man would look after the family. Also low wages.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, if at all. Women were not even that. Yes.
But even white women, they're all women.
Okay, yeah, yes, yeah. In the case of Africans, of course, women, that's a good point. Yeah. That's a good point, yes. Yeah. Yes, I know. No. My mother was a teacher, but the minute she married, she lost her job.
But she didn't get a pension?
And yeah, I know. Didn't get the pension. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So, so, but the interesting thing, regarding women in our case, is that in the early days of migrant labor, it is only men and boys that went to the cities, and women were left behind. The wife of A.C. Jordan, our A.C. Jordan, Phyllis Ntantala, passed away about 2 years ago, wrote a very interesting essay the widows of the reserves. And she argues then that these women were effectively widows because most of the time their husbands were in the cities, and when they're left alone with the children. And things became worse when their husbands, staying long in town, found new partners and didn't remit money back to the rural areas. So for all intents and purposes, the women became widows, despite the fact that they are.
So no unionization at that stage?
There were unions. There were unions, and I'm going to say something about unions later. Just no, but no, there were unions, right? So landlessness, forcing people to the cities, and low wages, right? Justifying the system. What, of course, the colonialists did not foresee, it seems, was the tension that would arise between limited access to land in the former reserves and a growing population. And in fact, if one is fair, I think colonialists realized even as early as 1913, when they were allocating 7% of the land, that the land would not be enough. Which is why they set up, soon after 1913, various commissions. And the most notable and the most important commission that was set up, I think it was 1914-16, was called the Beaumont Commission. And the brief of that commission was to look at the size of land that was made available, decide whether or not the land was enough, and in the event, new land, additional land would be required, the extent of that land. And it is this commission, of course, they did their work, made their recommendations, but because of changes in governments, it was the Smuts government, and then Herzog came, and so on. The process delayed, and it's only in 1936 that the provision of the 1913 Land Act about additional land was fulfilled, and that increased the percentage of land to 13%. But my argument is that despite that, 13% was too small for the majority of South Africans at the time, because Africans have always been the majority, right? And it was a population that was increasing. In my work, somewhere, right, I have the figures that will tell you the population, say in 1906, the population at various censuses, that were conducted and so on. But it's very clear that the population was rising and at a fast pace. So limited land, finite land, and a growing population led to a situation that was characterized by one of the surveys that were conducted in the early 30s, just about 2 decades after 1913, and that reported that there was overcrowding in the reserves, and that there were instances of soil erosion. And soil erosion. And those of you, who are familiar with this kind of history will remember that as a result of that, policies were formulated, and the best known of those policies was referred to as betterment planning, which was a conservation sort of plan to conserve land, because they were realizing that land was in danger because of overcrowding. And of course, I said that Africans were not even getting support from the state, right? Of course, what would Africans do? Once they realized that they could no longer use the land, and there were growing demands on for cash and so on, then they started moving to the cities, right, in large numbers. It was clear by the 1940s that Africans were increasingly relying on wages rather than land. One example that I like making, and especially when I was teaching a course on labor in sociology, right, and we're dealing with unions, trade unions, and early unions, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, ICU, which was established in 1919, right? Whenever there were strikes, migrant workers would leave urban areas and go home. And then at the end of the strike, they would come back, right? Which shows that they were not interested in what is happening in the cities. Their home was home. They didn't care about the struggles of urban workers. But in 1946, there was a famous or notorious strike, depending on where you stand. There was a strike, 1946 African mine workers strike. You can Google that. It was almost a rude shock to the rulers to see mine workers going on strike and demanding higher wages. A commission was set up. And in that commission, if you read it closely, constant point that was raised by migrant workers was that wages were low and that there was no possibility of them making a living at home.
But if you went back to 1913, surely in accepting the concept of cheap labor, the unions must have had something to do with increasing it, not just allowing their people to become victims of circumstance. Surely the unions were instrumental in making sure that the labor wasn't cheap.
Well, unions, maybe you have a concept of unions today, not in 1913. 1913, the story was different. And the story I'm telling, which I told deliberately, of migrant workers not striking in 1913, was that wages was seen as an imposition. But once they started starving in rural areas, which didn't happen in 1913, it happened over time. Then they realized that their weapon was cash through wages, and they took the issue of labor conditions and so on seriously, which is why for the first time they went on strike. It's like saying that look, why were farm workers not striking and only went on strike in 2012? You see, history is history, and people develop over time.
This means in 2012,
Yes.
the Zulus won all the agricultural prizes
Yes.
at the agricultural shows.
Yes. When in
12.
1912. Yes. Which shows that land was still,
Capable.
yeah, and land was still an important source of income. Yeah. Okay. Now, the question is, how did colonialists deal with this situation when people were moving into these urban areas? The mechanism that they used was a legal one, once again. They passed a barrage of laws, passed laws, influx control regulations. Now, if you have time, go to the archives and look at court cases. Here in Langa alone, then you'll see what I mean. Almost every day, working day, there would be a long list of people who would be charged. And they'll be sentenced almost as a group, right? The trials were not long trials, short trials, and they will all be found guilty for not having a reference book and not having rights to reside in an urban area. So they'll be sent to prison, but despite that, people violated the Infants Control Acts and regulations. And the situation became unviable in terms of state, the resources, and so on. And as we probably recall, in 1986, the Infants Control Regulation, that act, was scrapped. It was scrapped not because the apartheid state was being kind to Africans. It was scrapped because they knew that it was impossible to implement this piece of legislation. So the reality of a permanent presence of Africans in the urban areas gave rise to a range of problems, most of which remain unresolved. That's going to be relevant tomorrow and the other day. I want to highlight two problems that are still with us that can be traced to that era. The first one, and I know you're an economist and so on, and when I was doing a course in economic history, we dealt with the South African economy and the problems, particularly the problems of our economy, the ability of our economy, in absorbing its labor force. We realized that even in the 1960s, when the economy was performing, 1960s is often so after Sharpeville and so on, it's often characterized as a period when the economy went up and so on. It was unable to absorb its labor force. What used to happen then was that if you were an African and you were unemployed in an urban area, you would be taken to the reserves. So to the extent to which unemployment was invisible in white South Africa at the time, there were instances of unemployment back home in the reserves. Of course, when the reserves became independent, it was a problem of independent countries like Ciskei, Transkei, Venda, Botswana, and so on. But the reality was that taking South Africa as a whole, the economy, our economy, was not, and I want to argue, is not strong enough to absorb its labor force, then and now. So I think it's an important point that we must keep in mind in this debate. The other point that arose and became visible, especially from the 70s and so on, is the issue of housing. When people came here, they came here, they were not part of apartheid planning. Apartheid state provided housing, but the assumption was that the housing would be for workers who were in employment and workers who had residence rights in South Africa. But as we show, a number of people came illegally. And the question is, what happened to them? Where were they housed? They couldn't be housed in existing facilities, and they ended up occupying vacant land and established what we now call the informal settlements. Once again, for those of us who come from this part of the world, who follow the history of Cape Town, you will remember Crossroads. That's the best example. And there's a book now by Cole. I've met her and so on. But she wrote a very influential book on Crossroads, which I think was first an honors or master's thesis converted into a book.
Do you exclude the effect of the workers beyond our borders coming in? Surely that's a factor in how we deal with the workforce. How do you see that?
Once again, I mean, as an historian, when did that happen? Right?
It's happening now.
It's happening now, but I'm talking about then. You see, well, the way foreign workers were coming to the country, but those came under the migrant worker system, and they were controlled. They were minors, so they would come and they would go back home, right? And what you are talking about is a fairly recent development. So development is something that happened during our democracy. But I think that the machinery of the apartheid state was solid enough to take care of those kinds of workers, right? So without adequate housing, Africans who came to the urban areas ended up occupying, as I said, mainly state land. That's the point now I wanted to say. Somebody asked me whether municipality land is state land. And I said, yes, it is state land, right? So if you look or you read about informal settlements in South Africa, generally, you will find that the land that was occupied was mainly state land, commonages. Commonages that are controlled by municipalities. There are very, very few cases that I know of where private land held under freehold title by individuals, companies, corporates, that was seen as vacant land that was used. Of course, Malema makes threats that, look, if you see unoccupied land, occupy it. But that's more his policy. Hostels, that's a very good question. Hostels, housing during especially the apartheid period. Housing was divided into two categories. There was housing for migrant workers, people who left their families back home, right, and came here to work and would go back home. Hostels were built for them. They were accommodated in hostels. But especially in places, not in most of the cities, when manufacturing took over from primary industry, and there was need for settled, skilled labor, there was a provision that was made in law to allow people to stay in an urban area and have residence rights. Section 10, right? They call it Section 10, you see, and have residence rights. And those people were entitled to have a house. And 1959, in the case of Cape Town, Gugulethu was established. And people stayed there not as bachelors or as migrant workers leaving their family at home. They were allowed to stay with their families. But in the informal settlements, of course, there are gender issues. Gender issues involved in this, in the informal settlements, that they first, especially in Crossroads, the people who were leading that campaign were women. There were women who were starving in the rural areas. Their husbands or partners were not remitting money, and in some cases, no, they were not working. The jobs, no, were precarious, right? So there was not enough money, to take home. So women boldly came to the urban areas to look for work, but also, to look for their husbands and partners, right? So when once they're here, they were here, they initially stayed, with their men, but, because of overcrowding these rooms, they started occupying vacant land. Some stayed, with their men in the hostels. And there are, theses, that have been written now of women, who stayed in hostels and, put so much pressure that after 1994, hostels, were declared places of, suppose, human settlements. that term would apply there, because hostels were converted into places where people could stay with their partners and so on. Now, just note by way of concluding this, I say it is no exaggeration to say that by the advent of our democracy in 1994, no city or town, however small, could claim not to have its share of shacks. Wherever you went to, even small towns, dorpies in these commercial areas, like Steynsburg, Bergersdorp, Dordrecht, you'll find informal settlements on the Common Age and so on. And that happened in 1994. Now, I say it's significant because 1994, this is what we inherited from the past. And if you were to look at the picture today, I don't see what has changed. Maybe something has changed, but nothing fundamental has changed. But that's something we'll discuss tomorrow. Now, in conclusion, the issues raised in these lectures are, in my view, an integral part of the land question in South Africa. The land question in South Africa can never be adequately addressed and resolved without addressing land questions in urban areas as articulated in the lecture. Furthermore, land questions in urban areas cannot be resolved disregarding the broader questions of land shortage in the former reserves. And of course, now we know that the former reserves formed the backbone of capitalist development in South Africa. Thank you.
In the Land Accountability Research Center at the University of Cape Town, this is a booklet they issued.
Yes.
That film that I talked to you about.
Yes.
Okay, they make the point in this, and I wanted to know if you could help us with the answer.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about the Constitutional Review Committee will be hosting public meetings on the proposed review of Section 25 of the South African Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
The outcome of these hearings could determine whether land can be expropriated without compensation, playing a key role in the future redistribution of the land in South Africa. Now, that was something that was due to take place on August the 30th, 2018. What happened?
It's happened. There were public hearings, and a report has been written. It's been discussed in Parliament, and Parliament has decided that the Constitution will be amended.
Is that the key role that came out?
Yeah, that's the position as we speak right now. We'll say more about that on Friday. But that's what now. August, yes, of course, there were still hearings and so on. But by end of September or so, after September. I'll get the dates on Friday.
A little about title deeds the dearth of title deeds in urban areas.
Yes.
I'm led to believe that most of the houses that are occupied actually do not have title deeds. The owners of the house, the theoretical owners, do not have title deeds to those houses. And that there are some initiatives going on which I think are quite simple initiatives to give title deeds to the people who believe they're owners.
Do you mean now?
Yeah, right now.
Yes. Because, I mean, it's important not to know that up to 1994, no African was allowed to buy and sell land. So there were no title deeds 1994. But after 1994, and especially after 1996, when we adopted the Constitution, those restrictions, legal restrictions, disappeared. But there's only the formal part of it, right? And the question you are asking is about what is happening on the ground. What is happening in those areas where people occupied land? I think a number of things have happened there. There are areas where people occupied land that have been, I think the term this used is upgraded. Regarded as informal, formal, and proper structures sort of put in place. And that laid the basis for title deeds to be issued to individuals who were allocated a plot. Whether the title deed has been issued or not now, I haven't seen one. But I think this is something that one can easily investigate, right? And there are sort of projects like the N2, is it Gateway? Yes, you see it when you go to the airport, right? That was an informal settlement. But gradually that informal settlement is being formalized, right? And there are people houses, flats have been built there, and they have people have been allocated flats, and in some cases they rent land. I think they it's lease rather than buying sort of the flat. But I think in law, in those cases, the tenure, the tenure situation would have been formalized, right?
Does the title deed require that you pay for the land?
Well, upgrade in this case means that people it's deemed that they have a right to that land. But in the places where flats have been built, I think people are the flats are sold to them. Just as in cases where they rent, they are expected to pay rent. Maybe there are government officials here who will help.
One of the first things Charlotte when he became mayor of Johannesburg was to hand out title deeds to many people in Soweto. But one of the problems is that your grandparents were the first people to live in that house. Who do you allocate that house to? Is it the eldest son, the eldest daughter? Who's alive? Those are the social problems. So instead of the house belonging to the family, who does it actually belong to?
Yeah.
And that is a huge social problem that they actually haven't resolved.
Yes. Now that's in reference to houses that were built during the apartheid period. Yes. And then where people were paying a nominal rent but didn't own the land. After 1994, I know it in the case of my relatives in Gugulethu, that at some point they were told that you can actually buy the house. And buying the house in many instances, could be paying rates which were in arrears. And that, minute those rates have been paid, the house gets transferred to you. But the question is of who the land, I know in my family, was probably resolved by the fact that my elder cousin, brother, I called him brother, passed away, and the sister who was always looking after their house, looking after the grandmother, has no competitor. So the land is written in a name. Yes.
Has she got the title deeds?
Ah,
Many of these houses were almost given
yes.
without title deeds.
Yeah.
And so that the person living in the house believes the house belongs to them,
Yes.
only to find that they can't sell it, or well, they can sell it informally.
Mm-hmm.
But if they die, they can't leave it to anyone
Yes.
illegally, because the administration
Uh-huh.
is just so far behind.
Okay. Well, I mean, no, this is something that is researchable, and I'll see. No, I'll phone a few people, and see. I mean, even my relatives. No, I'll ask them whether they have a title deed, or whether no they. I suppose. I mean, in some instances, I mean, the accounts, municipal accounts, yeah, they're in their name, and maybe they think that because the bill is in their name, they own the house. But let's find out. But you may have something. Mm-hmm.
It does have a provision of that is very vague legislation. It is out in picking up the it does have a provision for land expropriation without compensation, but well, that's my view, that it's very vague. But anyway, that's not the question that I wanted to pose was that prior to 1994, was there a landlord budget check? Was it done? Because the way some question last day with the one that was reported in 2017.
Yeah.
Because the state itself, it does not give us a clear idea, because many people are saying that is not correct. There's state land, there's private land, there's occupied land, there's unoccupied land. So what is the legislation says that, the current legislation says that you may expropriate, it's legally under the certain is just and justifiable under that in terms of the new section now, which is provisional legislation. It's not yet approved, but is what is proposing. They say that abandoned land, what do you mean by abandoned land? Would that portion of land be productive? Would it be used? I mean, you can't just give the person an abandoned land, and if the person cannot use the land, how is it going to sustain you for generations and generations to come? There's also land that is not accounted for. There's also land that was bought by people who are not even South Africans. So how do we deal with all these issues? How do we regulate these issues? And if then there's no proper state, no proper audit, who owns what, and at one point, how do you even actually begin with the expropriation process in that?
Yes. Okay. The title deed. The title deed, no, I'm going to find out what the position is. The title deed, no, for people who lived in apartheid houses, whether they now have title deeds to, I mean, I know that, the principle is that the land would be transferred to.
One thing on that.
Yes.
In the late 1980s,
Yes.
we had a messenger. He lived in Gugulethu.
Mm-hmm.
And I went at him and we purchased his house for him because he'd been there for some time. We got title deeds for it. And he then owned the place. It was a very small, a couple of $1,000, several thousand.
Yeah.
And when he paid for it, he then had possession of it. And he was then able to sell it and purchase a flat in Mitchell's Plain. So there were title deeds.
Title deeds, okay.
And also we were involved in developing software for the land surveyors.
Yes.
And at that time, in the 80s, they were going around and surveying the various backyard structures.
Yeah.
So that people could, in fact, define where their land was. So that was happening in the 80s.
Okay.
It happened subsequently with that.
Okay. Well, we seem to have some answer that titles, some instances were issued.
I don't think in many cases they are.
Yes. But I think the problems now arise when we look at the so-called informal settlements, right? Because your task must be a difficult one, because you resolve sort of a land crisis today, And before you have finished building houses, new settlements arise. And so I think that here the best I can say here is that there is a formal process. And the formal process is that when one's land has been demarcated and you know where the boundaries are, then the basis for issuing a title deed exists. And that in some instances where there is no contestation, the title deed is issued. But because of this nebulous state of affairs, right, it's difficult not to say that each and every person who occupies a piece of land has a title deed.
I'm in and out of Lana quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a township that I know. There's a section called Beverly Hills.
Oh,
It consists of villas.
yes.
Now, as far as I know, these villas were built in the mid-late 80s.
Mm.
They were often acquired for senior level people by companies like Mobile World.
Mm-hmm.
I know they did these 1 or 2 properties. And the people who lived there then had to pay something towards the bond of the house.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be very surprised if the people of that particular section of Lana
Yes.
didn't own title.
No, they have. Yeah.
But right next to them,
Mm-hmm.
we have a former informal settlement.
Mm.
And the 2 or 3 different types of housing. We think from the mountain, driving towards the airport, we've got a section of white flats. And those were apparently let out without any reference to lists of people who were waiting for housing. It's a lot of, new people came in. Next to that is a section of small houses. Many of them are 2 stories, which was built by F&B. Now, for many, many years, at least 5 years, possibly longer, the people who could afford to buy them boycotted them because they felt the prices were too high. There was actually a point at which I was toying with the idea of buying one myself because they were 200,000 at that. But they had been 700. These have now been sold. I'd be very surprised if they don't.
Yeah.
Next to that, you get houses and flats, which have been given to people on the list, are waiting for what was once called Mandela houses or Hope houses. In other words, you earn little enough, 3,500 per household, and if you stand on the waiting list long enough and you've got a shack, you can move into one of these houses when your turn comes.
And pay rent,
Those
or?
people, I'd be surprised if they had title.
Yeah.
So I think
Yes.
it's quite a complex
Mm.
thing. Even in a tiny space
Yes.
like Lana,
Yes.
this is probably an area altogether that I've described 2 or 3 kilometers by 2 or 3 kilometers.
Yeah. And I go to Khayelitsha every day, there's a new settlement that springs up and so on. Yeah. And I mean, we're talking about at current no problem, but there are roots, historical roots to this problem. And which is the point I'm trying to make, that if you were a policy maker and your portfolio was housing, can you resolve a housing crisis of the nature we have here in Cape Town by just looking at inwardly? Or does it require that you have a better understanding of the land question?